morning, Polyphony. It's good to see everyone this January 2024. And I'm pleased to introduce to you our guest presenter today. Joshua Taylor is the Adjunct Professor of Sacred Music Studies in the University of North Texas College of Music and serves as the Director of Worship and Music at First United Methodist Church in Denton, Texas. Prior to returning to Denton, Dr. Taylor served as the musician for the ecumenical Iona community in Scotland, and previously he served as the Director of Worship and Music at First Presbyterian Church in Dallas, as the Director of Music at Trinity Presbyterian Church in Denton, and the Director of Choirs at Navo Middle School in Denton. A skilled liturgist, music educator, and conductor, Josh's responsibilities have included conducting youth choirs, coordinating Taizé worship experiences, and preparing liturgy for the congregations. He has served as well as serving at conference gatherings across the country. He's in demand as a guest lecturer, author, and seminar leader in areas of worship planning, the music of pilgrimage, which is our topic today, and as a conductor. He's presented sessions at ACDA national conventions, Texas Choral Directors Association, Southwest ACDA, Kansas Music Educators Association, and the Presbyterian Association of Musicians. And he's published numerous articles on worship and music, such as in the Choral Journal, A Call to Worship, publication of the Presbyterian Church USA, among other publications. He was named the North Texas Children's Choir Teacher in 2010, and that right there is commendable too, because being a teacher these days is a challenge, and so that's very good to know that Taylor is among teachers that have excelled. Dr. Taylor holds the Doctor of Pastoral Music degree from Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University, a Master of Music and Choral Conducting from Kansas State University, a Bachelor of Music Education from the University of North Texas, and a Certificate in Ministry from Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. Josh, as he wants to be called among us, it's good to have you with us today.
Thank you. I didn't know you were going to read the whole thing. But thanks for that introduction. I appreciate that. I'm so honored to be with you all and to have the opportunity to talk about this topic that I care a lot about, which is pilgrimage. And I thought I might, as Kyle and I were kind of working through the format for this, one of the first things he said was just to kind of tell you all a little bit about my story and how I came about this topic of pilgrimage. And it started out that this was going to be my dissertation research, mostly because I wanted to write about the Iona community and the Taizé community, which were kind of passions of mine. And as I was kind of settling on this topic to research and to write about, I found myself on kind of my own pilgrimage journey. I had been serving First Presbyterian Church of Dallas for 9 years, and was very happy there. Loved my work, loved my church, and there was a senior pastor change, and we all know how that goes in our business. And so all of a sudden found myself needing to make some changes. And so my family and I decided that we were going to go on a great adventure, and I was offered the opportunity to move to Iona and to live on the island of Iona in Scotland and to work as the musician for the community, while I was also researching the community and writing about pilgrimage. And the plan had been to be there for 3 years. And we had been there about 9 months when COVID happened, and so we were we were displaced again. We attended a staff meeting on the island. I think it was on a Tuesday, and we were told this virus thing's happening. Of course, the UK was taking it a little bit more seriously than the United States at that time, and and they said, we don't know exactly what's happening, but we've heard rumors that public transportation is about to be closed. And if you know much about Iona, or you know anything about getting to Iona, it involves two ferries and a long bus ride and a long train ride to get back to Glasgow. And so the leaders for the community said, if you have any intentions of getting off the island, we suggest that you do it now. And they also said, and oh, by the way, that would also mean tourists are not coming, people are not visiting the Abbey. So we'll feed you and house you as long as we can. But, you know, if you have other options for employment, you might want to take those now too. And so we left on the next to last ferry. We had 48 hours to pack all of our stuff, and I made some quick phone calls, and thankfully was able to get a new position in about 48 hours. And we packed our stuff and headed back to the United States with really no idea where we were going to land or what that was going to look like. And so what was interesting is at that time I was writing about this idea of pilgrimage and wrestling with, when we talk about pilgrimage, our mind initially goes to travel and to the actual literal act of pilgrimage. And there's, I think, hopefully we've all experienced those moments where we've had that disconnection from our community and have experienced growth through that experience of being within a different culture or a different setting that has made us sometimes, you know, appreciate more greatly where we come from and our background, but also has pushed us and challenged us to grow in ways that maybe we didn't expect. And so I started to realize that the church was also on somewhat of a metaphorical pilgrimage. And all of a sudden, my writing and the way of thinking about pilgrimage moved from being just about these actual literal trips to reframing our thought process about how we do ministry as being within a pilgrimage, what I call a pilgrimage theology, and trying to reframe our work as understanding that the church is changing all around us. And yes, we can take a little bit of time to lament that, but also maybe there's a real opportunity in that disorientation to move to a new place and to discover and be stretched in new ways. That's a positive thing. So, Kyle, I don't know if you want me to keep going or if you want to ask a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I was distracted with the moment with Josh just taking care of something here in our feed while we're together. Yeah, your process, the set of experiences you went through, how did that help you in your thought process regarding your work in the local church, but also in the postmodern life of the church?
Yeah,
the larger picture of the capital C church.
Yeah. I should have said that a lot of this, what I'm talking about today is taken from a book that I wrote called From Plague to Purpose, The Music of Pilgrimage and the Postmodern Church. And one of the things that I explore in the book is that when we look at, really when we look at the biblical narrative, and of course the Psalms for Ascent for us musicians is a good place to go look, but there are so many stories in the Bible where people come to their understanding of God and who they are in relationship to God while they're on the move and in places of disorientation. And so, we can go back as far as maybe the call to Abram, get up and go. We can talk about Adam and Eve. We can certainly talk about Moses. We can even talk about the incarnation of Jesus Christ and coming down from heaven to be among us as these moments where truths about God or the revelation of God is made known to us in movement. So I think there's a biblical witness there that at least started me on the journey. But then what also started, as I started researching pilgrimage and thinking about it, I kept coming across all these places where the historical church was tried to control pilgrimage, and it usually stood outside of the bounds of the normal church, and it scared them. So we have all of these writings going back to the Council of Trent, where the Council of Trent basically says that pilgrimage needs to be limited. And it almost seems as if the church was scared that there was going to be these epiphanies that were going to happen from this pilgrimage cycle, this pilgrimage journey. And you might be familiar with this idea. There was a sociologist, Arnold van Gennep, who defined the cycle of pilgrimage as being about the departure from our status quo, from who we are, through the journey, and then to the arrival at the destination, and then finally coming the return home. And then some anthropologists in the 60s started to look at that in a more metaphorical sense as a life cycle and a life journey type thing. Victor and Edith Turner started talking about this as a way of understanding self and kind of a self journey. So it's some of that heady work that I go into a lot more detail in the book about how we maybe could overlay that onto our ministry, and what does it look like when we're intentional about stepping out from where we've been, and doing that in an intentional way, not in a place where we're forced to move away from who we've been or what we've been, but intentionally step into this departing moment and joining this journey. Now, the interesting thing about working or thinking about it within a pilgrimage community, and if you've read Canterbury Tales, is the most famous example of this, that the narrative is formed through conversations that the people have on the journey together. And the value of the trip is determined by those joint conversations. Now, this is, for me as a music minister and musician in the church, this is very antithetical, I think, to who we are. And yet, there's an ethnomusicologist, Philip Beaumont, who writes about how music is actually the thing. We know this to be true, that music is the thing that actually cements or strengthens and makes this new reality, this new community, stronger. And so I started to think about that, and I thought, I'm a music person. I like to control the outcomes as much as I can. I'm careful about my music selections. I'm careful about the way that I rehearse my choir. I'm, hopefully a learned person about liturgy and about worship and about the way that I think about church. But what would it mean to step away from those certainties into a space of departure and of journey, and then inviting people into the conversation with me to help define what's sacred, what's holy, what's important going forward. And even as I say that, it's terrifying to me because it's so radically different than the way that I think we typically think about ministry in any form, music ministry or otherwise, to allow people to be a part of that process and to recognize that we might not always like their answer.
I believe what you've stated so far resonates with a lot of us, if not all of us gathered here live right now, virtually, and especially in regard to the challenges we're facing within the church during this era, this postmodern era that we've referred to it as for 20 plus years. Also, I suspect many of us are curious to understand from you how you believe music itself can serve well for the church moving forward, as it has over the centuries through these challenges that the church has gone through. Certainly, tell us what you think particularly about music for the church and within the church, or what you identify as pilgrimage communities. A
Sure.
pilgrimage.
I want to probably to answer that question the best is to talk about the Taizé community a little bit. And I think so many of us are familiar with Taizé's chants and the music that we brought in. What a lot of folks don't know is kind of the history of that community and the way that pilgrims and pilgrimage changed the community as a whole. So to give a brief history of the Taizé community, it was formed as a Protestant monastic community. It was meant to be a group of brothers living and worshiping together. Brother Roger, who founded the Taizé community, was a Swiss Reformed person. And so the earliest days of the Taizé community, they used a German Reformed prayer book. They sang German chorales. That was who they were. Some of their services were in French. A lot were in German because they kind of coming out of that tradition. And then all of a sudden, all these pilgrims start showing up, and it has a lot to do with Eastern Europe and the lack of religious identity in Eastern Europe during the Cold War. And so all of these pilgrims start showing up, and they're staying with at Taizé. And the Taizé brothers are kind of presented with this conundrum of, do we change our worship and our identity to provide hospitality and to be able to worship with all of these people that are finding their way to our doorstep? And I think what's really revolutionary about the community of Taizé is that they make this very conscious choice to give up what has been their worship and music identity in favor of adopting something that has been co-created, if you will, with the pilgrimage community that is a part of their world now. And so obviously we know what the fruits of those labors are. It's a repetitive chant, and it's these Taizé things that are meant to not require prerequisite knowledge, that don't take long to learn, things like that. And I don't know that Taizé music is necessarily the answer, though there are a lot of movements, obviously, around like Paul Vassil's doing that work with paperless music. You've got Iona doing shorter songs. You've got all these different ideas. I don't know that any of those are the answer in and of themselves, but I wonder, what does it look like for us, the established church people? Or would we be willing to give up our identity that much to be shaped by the people that found their way to us? And you would think that the author of the book and the person that's presenting the question would be like, absolutely, let's go. Scares the hell out of me, because I don't know that I'll be any good at it. But I think that's the matter of faith in it, isn't it? That God is present in that, and that the church has been here before us, and will be here after us. And so I think historically speaking, maybe that's why the Big C Church was a little scared of this concept of pilgrimage and of collective thinking, if you will. So music, I think, plays a role in that idea and that way of doing ministry together. But I don't know that I would be ready to define what musical forms that means, or what the musical bounds of that are, because I think they're contextual to each of our ministry. Kyle and I were talking before we started this call about here at First United Methodist in Denton. The University of North Texas had the first jazz degree in the United States, and is known as a jazz school. And so this church has a service that's heavily that's jazz. And so at one time it included 9 horns, playing jazz arrangements of modern worship music, because that was what was contextually accurate for this place. But now we're feeling this shift that's happening within our community, and there are people lamenting that kind of old jazz thing is gone. And then other people that are saying, yeah, but we need to let it go because it's not connecting within the broader community the way that it was previously.
As we're talking about pilgrimage, tell us, I think we should maybe sort of back up in a way, and what you mean by pilgrimage, quote, pilgrimage, and tell us more about pilgrimage in historical terms, just so that as we're processing this today.
Yeah, so it's kind of an elusive term to think about, but going back to kind of where I started, even for me in my own journey of writing and thinking about this, at first I was literally thinking about literal pilgrimage, and I was thinking about, we take our choirs on trips, and for many of us that's part of our world, or we travel ourselves, and music is a part of those travels, and that's where I started, was in this literal place of what does pilgrimage look like, and how can we create experiences for our people where we remove them from the confines of our buildings, of our even our communities, our towns, so that we might grow spiritually, but also as a community through shared experience, right? And so I think that's one way of thinking about pilgrimage. But what that doesn't capture is it doesn't start to capture what our motivations are and what our hopes are for entering into that journey. And then it doesn't capture the idea of can we be on a pilgrimage metaphorically without physically departing. And I would really contend that the church in a post-COVID, postmodern existence is on a pilgrimage. I'm serving in a Methodist church. I joke that I'm a Presbyterian masquerading as a Methodist because my heart is still probably in the Presbyterian church. My earliest childhood was in the Southern Baptist church, and I know you all probably know a little bit about that. My joke has been for years that I was baptized by a somewhat infamous Southern Baptist preacher who is now at First Baptist Dallas, spends a lot of time on Fox News. And my joke for years has been to ask all of the pastors that I've worked with whether or not I should have my baptism redone, because maybe it didn't take. Anyways, that was just a diversion. But I think in this, the Methodists are dealing with this schism that's happening within their church, and trying to figure out where they're going to go beyond that. We're all living in a postmodern context, which is characterized by a mistrust of institutions, and we see that playing out everywhere in our society. And we're facing, Pew Research has all the statistics that you can want to read about how our congregations have aged, how philanthropic giving, generosity is down across the board for all organizations, even though religious giving is still the highest among philanthropic giving. But all of these things are in decline. And so the question is, I think, becomes acknowledging that we're on a journey right now. The church is reforming right in front of us, and as musicians, I think we have an opportunity. We can sit there and lament, and there is space for lament. There's a time for lament, but we can sit there and lament, or we can acknowledge that we're somewhere in this pilgrimage cycle, We have departed the church as we know it, and we're somewhere in a journey. The destination is somewhat elusive, but I'm just maybe dumb enough to think that that music might actually be the place that answers some of these questions and that helps revitalize the church in a new way. But I don't know that that's the traditional music ministry that we've always had. And I think that's probably different in Denton, Texas than it is in Dallas, Texas, than it is in Charleston, South Carolina, or where Missouri, wherever you might be. And so the ways that we support each other and the ways that we think about our professional organizations, about training in church music, all of these things have to shift.
Josh, I'll try not to be devious and cloak a comment with a question, but really, you know how people do that.
Yep.
I am reminded, a couple of things you've said reminded me of sort of the classic Robert Webber line, all worship is local.
Mm-hmm.
You've heard him say that when he was living and sort of on the circuit. Is that helpful in any way? Is that a piece of that? Is that a you know, sort of a candle in the darkness to figuring out what in the world? How do you finally, as a practitioner, what choices do you make? Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, I think so, because I think where the pilgrimage idea comes into that comment, and that has not necessarily been our usual way of thinking about it, is how do we invite others into, as a practitioner, how do we invite others into that process? And that is, that for me is the big question. On pilgrimage, the pilgrimage community is defining what's sacred. They're defining, they all are coming from their individual context, as we each do, right? We all come from our own religious context. We all have those, to use hymns as the example, we all have those ones that speak to our being in some way. And you say, this is my favorite hymn. And I go, I can't believe you like that. Why in the world would you ever want to sing that one? You know, whatever that might be. And there's this negotiation process that happens within pilgrimage groups. And this is well documented throughout history. You can read it. It's too dense to go into probably in this setting, but you know, the Marian songbook on the way to on the Camino, for instance, that's part of it. That songbook's been compiled over time with pilgrim groups, different pilgrimage groups adding or subtracting from that book along the way. And so there's this this negotiation process that happens where all of a sudden, not only is all of worship local, but all of a sudden it's a collective process. We're no longer the knowledgeable other. We're just one person. We're one voice within a broader conversation. And again, I think that's somewhat threatening to us. I also think it's a difficult process because we don't want it to sink to just I like that or I don't like this, but really a deeper conversation about this is our identity as a worshiping community, and that's manifest musically in this way. Does that make sense, Doug? Or build off of what you're saying there?
Yeah. I was trying not to interject my sometimes strong opinions too much into the conversation. Sure. Some of my colleagues are smiling or are smirking. I think the tension you've identified that's really interesting to me is the tension between identity and hospitality.
Mm-hmm.
To me, those are the two words that emerge as sometimes there's a tug of war there. Because I think most of us would, I'll just speak for myself. I would say that clarity of identity is a key to a flourishing congregation. I'm going to put it that way.
Sure.
And at the same time, I would say that biblically and theologically, to be real followers of Jesus, we've got to struggle with how do you welcome the stranger? Okay. So if you put those two stakes in the ground, sometimes those are at cross purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think I agree with you completely. And I think the interesting thing is looking at, again, where I said I started with this was I wanted to write about Iona and Taizé. And those are both communities that have wrestled with that idea of biblical theological identity and hospitality. And then somewhere along the way made the decision to allow the presence of the stranger, the presence of the pilgrim, to change their identity. And I don't know in either case that I would say that they compromised theologically or biblically who they were by that change. I will say that they changed, they allowed their identity to be changed significantly in the way that they gather and organize themselves as a community. So for instance, the Iona community, the modern day Iona community was started, George MacLeod founded the Iona community because during the Depression, he thought that the seminaries were doing a lousy job of preparing seminarians to actually do real ministry with blue collar people in Glasgow who were out of work. And so he got this idea that he could gather up all these out of work tradesmen and seminarians. Of course, at that juncture, it's all men, and that he would load them up and take them to Iona, and they would rebuild the abbey together. At that time, the abbey was in ruins, and that they would rebuild it side by side, and that would allow the out-of-work tradesmen to have a connection to a spiritual life through being next to a seminarian, and a seminarian would gain perspective on what was actually happening in the life of people that were going to be in their parishes when they went back into the slums of Glasgow. And what very quickly happened is this recognition of the disconnect between those disparate groups. And if that was going to work, that worship models, music, all of these things were going to need to shift to accommodate both groups. And born out of that really is the idea of a lot of the ideas of Celtic spirituality. If you're, so many people are familiar with Celtic spirituality. People on Iona and people that are affiliated with the Iona community will tell you, it's all made up, right? Because it is. A lot of it's kind of a farce. It was the Church of Scotland at the time was incredibly strict and rigid. And George MacLeod was trying to reform worship practices to better accommodate this community of out-of-work tradesmen and seminarians. And he got around the rules and regulations of the Church of Scotland by claiming that the practices he was doing were Celtic practices. And one of his students, proteges, if you will, was J. Philip Newell, who has made a rather large sum of money writing books on Celtic spirituality and leading workshops on Celtic spirituality and things of that nature. So some of it is rooted in maybe something historical, but a lot of it's kind of made up. And Iona claims that proudly, but I think the rest of the world goes, what? And kind of gasps in amazement. But I think the question there is, I don't think he compromised on his identity. I think he looked around and said what he had learned as a Church of Scotland pastor was not necessarily what the people that were gathered in this community needed to be faithful disciples and to gather in worship. And that gave rise musically to connect that, because we're musicians on this call, right? But musically, that led to a explosion of new hymn texts being written on the subjects that this community that was growing was passionate about, and hymns that expressed their faith, and then new forms, because the pilgrimage community is always changing. So the acknowledgement that, whatever hymn it might be, that we assume everybody knows, the Iona community went to a place of saying, what if we turn it upside down and make the assumption that absolutely nobody in our midst knows this song? And, I don't know that we think that way. If we plan to sing Amazing Grace in worship on Sunday, we really truly assume that everybody in the room knows Amazing Grace, and that we don't need to teach it. We don't need to have any conversation about the imagery of Amazing Grace. We don't need to, we just make this assumption that if they're in our worship, that they're enough like us, that's a part of, it's a commonality between us, right? But what happens if we don't assume that? And what happens if are we compromising our identity by saying, could we imagine a world, going to a somewhat heady place, but could we imagine a world where we chose as a community to give up Amazing Grace because the community as it was presented with us right now, that was not a real expression of our identity? And that's the different, for me, that's the thought process that is very, very different. And I wonder if in the current context of our church, if we better start thinking that way a little bit, because we have a generation, generations, plural now, maybe, who are coming up, whose parents really have no church religious identity. We have another fascinating thing, and just getting a little off topic, but Kyle and I were talking about this before the call started. There's a new book. It's several years old now, but Lester Ruth and Sui Hong Lim wrote a book called "Loving on Jesus," and the subtitle is the short, concise history of contemporary worship. And they poke fun at themselves in the book by saying, the book's like 100 pages long, and they poke fun at themselves by saying this book is short because it's a short history. But it's been around long enough that there is a history. And one of the things towards the end of the book that they kind of wrestle with is we are now seeing a younger generation of people who seem to be gravitating toward ritual practice, who have zero concepts of church ritual because they've grown up in a church where ritual was absent. And so they're now in this process of creating ritual and defining ritual studies and ritual practices for their own community with no prior knowledge. Isn't that interesting? And these are the people that are coming and sitting in the pews in our church and who are asking the question of, why do you do communion that way? Like, why does it matter? And then we try to give them this lecture about, sacramental theology, and that's not really what they're asking. They're asking more like, yeah, but tell me why. And like, well, we have these kneelers and this is the way that we go about that. Yeah, but who cares? Why? And we say, well, we get to to that awful church phrase, because that's the way we've always done it. And then we're scared to invite them into the conversation, or at worst, we push them out of the conversation. And so I think the pilgrimage mindset is one of saying, what if we just start at the place where that conversation is the beginning of who we are? I'd be happy to take other questions because I feel like I've dumped a lot of stuff out there to ponder.
I was just about to open this up to see if there's others that have questions or interject with feedback with what they're thinking.
Oh, I didn't say feedback.
Right.
I'm
Well,
kidding. No, I mean,
what I've been thinking about is years ago in seminary, and what the last at least 30, 40 years has been a change in seminary education, at least when I was there 20 years ago, was already being discussed among those that were doing missional work on, is that there was this old model, colonial model, that we go in and we're on mission to bring them to Jesus, and but we're bringing all our traditions, everything, our culture, the way we think about Christianity, and imposing on them. Whereas the last 50 years, there's been a change in how missionaries do life in other communities. And I've been thinking about that as I've been listening to you, Joshua, that we could learn from those who really have done missional work, those who are peers of ours. Maybe that's where a conversation we had too,
well,
because
isn't that
ones
interesting?
that have been on pilgrimages and have
Yeah.
been in a place to humble themselves and learn from the culture that they're embedded in, and from the
Yeah.
people that they're living with, their neighbors.
Yeah, I was going to say, isn't it interesting to say that we could learn something from mission colleagues? And I was just thinking about there again, these are people that have disoriented themselves from their local community. They've traveled somewhere, and it can be literal travel, obviously, but it's just this it's this idea of kind of uprooting ourselves from our understandings. Sometimes it takes a physical relocation to do that. But yeah, I think that could be something really interesting to interesting conversation partners. And again, to connect that back to the idea of pilgrimage work, you see that in Iona, the amount of global music. And global music is an interesting thing, because when it first came on the scene, there was a certain amount of tokenism about it, that let's bring in some global stuff just to pat ourselves on the back a little bit and go, look, we sing global music.
Right.
It's another thing if you start to really like say, what is the testimony, what is the witness of faith that's present in this global music, and how does it differ from what we normally do? And it's not because it's accompanied by drums or whatever. There's a person behind it, and there's a testimony of faith. And what if we allow that to change us? Strophic hymnody is what we all, I mean, what I love. I won't make the assumption for you, but I love the theology that can be embedded within a strophic hymn. But what is the expression of faith, or the experience of faith through a cyclical global song? How is that person expressing their faith in a different way? And how are we allowing that expression to shape our own experience of Christian identity?
Yeah, I think about, as like in our context here in Kirkwood Baptist Church here in St. Louis, we sing some global songs, but they've been singing them for a while now, and it's not a token thing anymore. It's like, well, no, we value this. Some of the liberation, I think about some of the liberation theology that comes out of some songs from Central America, South America, Spain, those songs that have changed the way I think and others think, and under our steeple here, about relationship with God, God's relationship with the world, our relationship with the world because of God's relationship with the world, and the Missio Dei, the mission of God, and not our mission,
right.
God's mission. And yeah, so we could, there's a lot that we could, the pilgrimage music, the music for pilgrimage, we don't have to go someplace. It can come to us if we open up our worship service more, expand it.
Yeah.
I have a question.
One of the
Oh, so go. Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt. So, but I have a question.
No,
First of all, Joshua, I was sitting in your present. You and I talked. I think this last summer, but at Montreat. But
we
I
were
was
at
in.
Montreat together. Yeah,
Yeah, and I was in your conference that the workshop that you gave it in Minneapolis, I think, whenever that was, a long time ago,
yeah,
ACBA,
yeah.
and that
Yes.
was when you were in
Yep.
Dallas,
Yeah,
and you had
yeah,
a
that's right.
on kind of on building a good rehearsal. It wasn't rehearsal techniques, but I think it was just paying attention to the content and in your literature that you're bringing in, or something like that. You had a lengthy list of anthems that you shared with those of us that were in that session. And I don't remember what year that was. I don't know if anyone else was out there. Maybe it was 20.
16 maybe.
Okay, somewhere in there. Okay. And but I wonder if your repertoire list how that would change in these years. Would it be the
Oh,
same? Would you still be bringing the same under choral, and I'm wondering about the shorter song and the value of the shorter songs. Is this a form that fits the way that we all think now, in shorter,
yeah.
compact? So there's not a lot of room for strophic hymn. There's two things in my question for you.
Yeah.
So how has your choral literature, or your choir literature, how has that changed? And
That's well, you made my summer when you told me that you remembered me from that presentation all those years ago. That was, boy, was that a big stroke of my ego right there. But I wonder if I would be as audacious about putting together that list to begin with, and is where I think I've come in the time. And what I was starting to say, Warren, was that right before your question was some practical ways that I've tried to put this into practice. And I actually think that connects to your question a little bit. I have formed several groups in this current church to have conversation, to be conversation partners about our worship. And one of those groups is my music staff here, where we sit down with. We still kind of follow what I would call a traditional pattern of the way that we plan. Everybody kind of goes off and does their own planning for their ensembles and things like that. But then we come into a staff meeting, and I actually ask them to write up the text of anthems, or to describe, if it's instrumental, organ music, whatever, to describe what it is about that piece of music that they think is relevant. And we read the texts together without the music in front of us. We just read them like poetry. And we talk about the theological ideas, and essentially we kind of almost do I don't know, Bible study is not the right word because we're not necessarily studying scripture, but we just kind of do a class of wrestling with those texts together, of saying, I don't actually think that's right. Or I don't like that. And it's divorced from the musical aspect of it, because we're not playing on the idea of this is a really great tune that everybody that will sing really well or whatever, but just truly wrestling with, well, what is it that we're trying to say? So that's one group. We are a younger staff. I turned 40 on Monday, and so I'm not sure how much longer I can say that I'm part of a younger staff, but most of my colleagues are younger than me, and so we're a younger staff that serves an older congregation, and so I then have another group of congregation members that a lot of our work is done via email, but we have an email chain where we talk about the expression of worship for that week and how it resonated with that particular group. And then more rarely, like a quarterly, I put the two groups together. And what I acknowledge, and actually one of my goals for 2024 is trying to figure out how we would do that, how to embrace the full pilgrimage idea, we need the voices of the people who are not in our database. We need the people from outside to also be dialogue partners in that. But as we are as a congregation right now, we're disparate enough between the age, some of the age discrepancies, and the people that mostly participate in modern worship and the people that mostly participate in traditional worship, that it can turn into a real slugfest, all in love. But, it's and Amazing Grace is an interesting example of that, because we have unchurched younger members in the modern service who get so hung up on that word wretch, and really, really, really struggle with Amazing Grace because of that idea of our wretchedness. And they're not really interested in having a conversation about a doctrine of sin. That's just not really like what they're interested in having. They're interested in talking about how they receive that word and that idea of being a wretch. And I think, again, that's turning our thought upside down. And it's a different way than we used to approach it. The way that we used to approach that was, if somebody takes exception with that, we just need to educate them. So let me sit down and as the knowledgeable other, as the person on top, let me tell you what you need to think about that. So Warren, I don't know. I'm certain that my list would have changed. And obviously it's a different audience too with an ACDA convention, and I am still bold enough to put in front of my university students because they're getting a grade and they pay money to come hear me pontificate. This was a free webinar. But so I do with my university students still somewhat assume that they need to be coached in acceptable church repertoire, and at least giving them the tool bag from which to begin to build the idea of a Christian vocation. But yeah, that list would certainly be different.
Sure.
Josh, my pastor here at the church, he was not raised in Christianity, and so his philosophy here has been, now First Baptist Church of Augusta is like a well-established church, very old. We're coming up, well, we've already hit our 200-year anniversary. He wants every worship service, he wants us to keep in mind that whoever, there is someone sitting in the pew or someone sitting in the room that has never been to a church before. Mm-hmm. So what are we saying and what are we doing when we lead worship so that they feel welcomed? Because the minute you get up there and you say, well, if we're going to stick with Amazing Grace, we're going to sing this hymn that we love. How do they love it if they've never heard it before?
Right.
And then on the other end, I got up one Sunday morning and I said, you may not be familiar with this hymn. And I spoke very briefly about it, just saying that it was, a wonderful way of how we could receive God's love and then share it with everyone else. And it was share his love, which has been around for a while. And I had like 3 church members write me and say, I've known that hymn forever.
Yeah.
And I was trying to let them know, well, I wasn't saying that for you, I was saying that for the others in the room.
Sure.
The biggest struggle for me has been, how do we walk that line of acknowledging that there's someone in the room who we're anticipating has never been to a church before, while at the same time not throwing out some of the traditions or the knowledge that we have, if you want to go as far as, like the liturgical season or anything like that. I've noticed it's really hard to walk that line of it has made me more aware. Sorry, I'm scatterbrained. It's made me more aware that I don't need to use the answer of, well, it's the way we've always done it. It's actually kind of enhanced the beauty of why we have some of these traditions for me. So knowing the reason why we have some of these traditions and understanding the beauty of it, I can't just throw it out the window, or I have to pull myself back and not just breaking out into a whole educational reason as to why we should be doing
Sure.
what we're doing. It's challenging.
It is challenging. And but I think we're living in a challenging time for the church. And I think we all, our sense of calling, we have been called for this time and for this place. And so that challenge is indeed our challenge. And as I'm listening to you talk, because I'm like, yeah, that's me. That I'm in that same boat, And what was kind of revolutionary for me was the question when you say we're going to sing this hymn that you all know and love this hymn, right? And then you say, well, what? There's somebody out there that doesn't know that hymn, and so how can they love it if they don't know it? What do we ever ask the question of that person? What is the song that you know and that you love? And what is the song that and I would frame that, because we don't just want any random song, obviously, but what is musically, where have you experienced God? Is maybe how I would ask that question. And are we open to the possibility that that could be secular, that could be something very outside the realm of what we are trained to do, that could be something that really pushes us beyond the bounds? And I think when that conversation becomes a two-way street is where we get to have the conversation about, well, part of the reason we do this blank is because there's this rich tradition behind this, and here's why. And we get to give them the educational piece, but then they also get to be a dialogue partner in that process of saying, hey, you know what? That's really interesting, or I never knew that, or I never thought of it that way. And then it becomes this back and forth. And instead of it being, that's the way we've always done it, we do it because we've decided to share that identity together. And you can talk about this on a micro level or a macro level or whatever you want to, however you want to do it. And it's still hard work. But how do we intentionally build those feedback loops and those groups, and just position ourselves to be open to departing status quo? And that's for me, the idea of the pilgrimage cycle it's just a metaphor that works for me, but it's the reality I think that we're facing as church musicians, church professionals for this bizarre. I think it's okay to say this bizarre time in the lives of our church.
Thanks.
Thank you. This is, I knew going into this session that we were not going to put, and Joshua knew this too, put a bow on this, because this is really starting a conversation, really. And I just want to remind you, I should have done this at the onset, is to say the most recent book, his most recent thing that Josh has written is this book that we have been diving into this topic today, From Plague to Purpose, Sacred Wandering in the Postmodern Church. And I encourage you to get a copy and read it, and to continue to have this conversation with others in your churches, your contexts, because I think you're right. With the first session that brought us together, the very first session that brought this Polyphony group together in this format through Zoom, it was with Terry Johnson in May of 2020, saying to us, we are in a wilderness experience right now. We were already talking about, this is a journey. We talked about it. So we've been on a pilgrimage together as a group here, those here today and others among us in Polyphony and our churches for the last 4 years. going through we're in the midst of a wilderness experience. Yeah. And so,
Yeah, if may I say one more thing about that? Because I would love to get more people, and I think musicians are more comfortable with it than pastors, which is this of recognizing the holiness in what I call sacred wandering, in this idea of that there isn't an answer, and because you mentioned tying it up on in a bow. What if the only answer is that there are just more questions? And the subjective nature of what we do, no choral anthem is ever done, because there's always something that we could fix. There's always some rehearsal technique we could be better at. If organists, God love them, they understand this better than anybody because they wander all the time. I mean, how do you choose to play an instrument that you can never perfect because every single instrument is different? And talk about just self-torture. But the holiness of sacred wandering, and accepting that as being where we are as ministers right now.
mm-hmm. Yeah. And Josh, you saying, what if there's just questions? We're just left with questions. Reminds me of the benediction I'm about to offer here, that Terry York has written in the last year or so, that he has graciously shared with all of us in this group, and that I've used each week at Polyphony. That Terry York said years ago in a class that I was in, he said, well, sometimes I've discovered is over time, I'm living with more questions than answers. And yeah, and being at peace with that. Yeah. So I offer this benediction, and then following the benediction, we will wrap up with the benediction. But if you can remain for an announcement, an update on the conference from Doug Haney, I encourage you to do so. But I will close with this benediction now. And now to you who have been called to sing amid the shouts and cries and slogans, to you who have been called to sing love to hearts full of hate, to sing truth in the cacophony of falsehood, to sing community in the barren places of isolation, to sing peace in the midst of deadly conflict, to sing embrace in the midst of denial. To you, musicians of the song of grace, may God grant always yet another song, a song of courage to be hummed until God's words appear at the time of testing. Amen. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you all very much. Yeah.